when Spock fans first got upset. Yeah. Today on Trekland Tuesdays Live with me, Dr. Trek, it's number 313. Right. Coming at you right here from the heart of Trekland through Portal 47 via Trekland Trek for some sanity, clarity, and the big picture in all things Star Trek. So here we are back for another Tuesday. Here we go. We're back in the middle of Strange New World. I do want to say before we hit the topic today, I have a sub bar that I want to get into, and look at this. I'm so proud to pass the word on this. Actually, there's been several crowdfunders and Kickstarters and GoFundMe's happening lately. Was proud to help Frank Zanke out with for his original comic series. I was very happy to help out our guest last week, Glenn Swanson, with for getting extra costs associated with his book, I Can't Wait, Inspired Enterprise. That's what it was, about NASA, the military, the Smithsonian, all their influences on the original series and spin-offs well into the 70s. Can't wait for that. And today I am over the moon to tell you about another very, very deserving crowdfunder. Let's just go to it here. This is right off her page, her Kickstarter. Look, Andy Richardson, Andrea Kindred, who was Gene Coon's assistant in the 60s, knew all the civil rights leaders, worked with Malcolm, Martin, and Edgar when they would be in L.A. as a young woman. Lived in Australia the last 40 years. A lot of you know her story, especially if you've been. I've done all I could since, 2017, 2018, her first trip back to the U.S., and especially the last couple of years. Her book, she did a special edition just for her Star Trek story. She's writing her memoirs, the whole thing, including all of her years now as a storyteller in Australia and her fight with the indigenous folks of Australia even. She's putting her life in a book, From Slavery to the Stars, personal journey. She's crowdfunding this for an audiobook. If any of you were there last year at Star Trek Las Vegas, we had her on the Trek Files. You can hear her voice. We have video of that session. We did a 1-hour panel. I was so thrilled to moderate. She was such a hit. But hearing her stories and all in her own voice is amazing. And this audiobook project would go a long way toward fulfilling that. Now you can see she had this very humble goal there, and she's made it already. So what's going on? Well, she's got 9 days to go. If there was anybody deserving of having her crowdfunder go over, because there's always incidental costs. You're talking about a very humble amount here. I just want to make sure. I told her I would help boost it. She got out of the gate so fast that it wasn't like critical, but I would be remiss if I did not. Oh man, what a force of nature. What an incredible story. What a wonderful, warm-hearted person. If you had the chance to meet her live, if not, just watch our special videos of the Trek Files. I think there's video of the panel we did out there too, but you can see her video on her site here too when you get over to it. We'll get the site up in the chat, but just From Slavery to the Stars, just jump on her keywords here, and we'll get that up before the end of the show and later on, obviously. But yes, she needs a shout out. She's got 9 days, not the biggest campaign. That's part of what's charming about it. She's being very humble with it. Her book itself has already been pre-ordered and funded that way. So yay. And of course, once the initial pre-publications, her self-publication is done, she's still looking for a major publisher to pick it up and run with it. And it would be very deserving. She's been through the mill. She's had editors work on it. I've read it in a couple of stages. Some other fan historians have read it. She's had a couple of professional copy readers at it. But this is a campaign to produce her audiobook. And there's perks. So I'll let you check that out. Our main topic today is something that's come up organically. Strange New Worlds, I mentioned. A lot more of the world is able to see it. I'm so thrilled a lot of the world is able to see it on the same day or still at least next day. But more and more people are getting Star Trek back. I've just noticed an interesting phenomenon. Now, you tell me. We can talk about this in the chat in a little bit. I want to say, and I'm always talking about pendulum swings and what a difference a year makes, much less a decade. Perception is everything, even with our Star Trek universe and fandom. And last year, when Star Trek Strange New Worlds premiered, it was the result, remember, of an organic campaign, nothing manufactured by the studio. It was a groundswell that sprung up the minute Not even so much the minute Ethan Peck got on screen as long-haired Spock in season 2 of Discovery, but the minute Anson Mount hit the ground running as Captain Pike. It was Anson. It was the way they wrote him. People wondered why you couldn't write this the year before. Why couldn't these scenarios have come about the year before? Well, because it was the Chaos on the Bridge Part 2 moment for the first season of Discovery. But ever since then, it's been nothing but goodwill toward Ensign Mount and Pike, toward everyone around him, Rebecca Romaine, Ethan's Spock, etc., and the idea and the demand and the losing your shit when you saw the Enterprise at the end, even if it was a bus station bridge, even for the idea. The fact that it was going to come was another fandom triumphs moment there. Fan ownership. It's also voting with your dollars, and any idiot, any capitalist media mogul worth his salt is going to follow the money. What's wrong with that? So when you can get the owner and the fan interest aligned, it's a beautiful thing. And that's why we have Strange New Worlds. Even bumping, with a little help from schedule of its Starlead, but even bumping Section 31 and even the Starfleet Academy's development, maybe, went through at least 2 showrunners, including the one that's got it now, 2 production development teams. So that was a ton of goodwill for Strange New World coming out of the gate. And then when it finally debuted last year, people falling over themselves, fans, mainstream critics, even geek-adjacent Trek people, Trek-adjacent geek people, all the geek sites, much less pretty universal love. Now, there are a lot of bits and pieces. There were little canon grumbles along the way about Gorn, rapidly retconning, about T'Pring and about Chapel being too familiar. I was able to retcon that. In fact, it's not just retcon, it's a texture, not trivia moment, okay? It makes it even richer just because you've carried around in your headcanon for 20 or 30 years, 40 maybe, the way things are because it made sense. Now it's just like science, astronomy, archaeology, maybe even basic data from an election 2 years ago. You're always finding new layers that you're rightly or wrongly didn't get. That's fine. That's fine. Now, it makes some fans nervous when you're like riding the ridge there in a canon universe. And of course, you'll always have folks who go, canon, just tell me a story. I don't care. But I'll say again, that's the 5th C of Star Trek. There are lots of franchises where you have great concepts, great characters, great casting, and even great commentary. I still say it's Star Trek's canon without having to resort to multi-universes or having it baked in the DNA, that's Doctor Who. That's cool. Change. I'm still saying that's what makes Star Trek unique among all these uplifting franchises of fantasy. And I don't mean capital F fantasy, you know what I mean? Science fiction fantasy. The real Strange New Worlds that are out there that fire our imagination and our hopes and dreams and faith in the future and want to give us faith that there will be a future, which has been Star Trek's mission since day 1, 1966, or even day 1, 1964. Although I tend to think it was baked in the cake and not as overt. We've talked about that on the Trek Files. Looking at the birth documents from 1964 and even into 65, both pilots, no one's talking so much about what a brave new world of optimism and diversity and all that. That kind of grew and had to be made obvious. And I say all that because when you talk about IDIC and diversity and infinite combinations and infinite diversity, you're kind of getting back to the original hero, the original breakout star, the original breakout aliens of Star Trek, of course, Spock and the Vulcans. And Spock and the Vulcans are what drove really an awful lot of, if not in the initial wave, a chunk of the initial wave. But after Star Trek was dead, when your adventure show lovers passed on, when your sci-fi of the moment geek kids maybe passed on, Star Trek had such a hold. Nothing like it had ever been seen before, which is why we still have it 60 years later. Star Trek opened the door for Star Wars to be a franchise, and now we think about franchises, and that was a concept that didn't even exist until the early 80s, mid 80s. So, Spock has been the hub, despite Shatner and Kirk's stardom, despite that incredible supporting cast that got more their due. They laid the groundwork in the series, but they got their due in the movies. It's kind of just the opposite of what happened to the Next Generation crew until Picard season 3. No, so I'm just reminding you, if you didn't know, the central place that Spock and Vulcans had and why we even have Star Trek today. It also was the reason why, led by Vulcans, Gene did not want to touch anything of the original series, touchstones when they created Next Generation. We talk about this all the time on the Trek Files. That's why it was so shiny bright that it had to be avoided. The glare of Spock and Vulcans had to be avoided for years and years and years. Unfairly, maybe until you get to, Sarek was an amazing moment. That was kind of a toe in the water. Aside from having background extras as Vulcans, a one-off tiny guest star. Looking at you, the Relva 7 test class there. But it really took until sticking your toe in the water with Tuvok as a full-blood Vulcan, did anybody, years later, 3 series later, did anybody think to start creating Vulcans again? And then, of course, T'Pol, because that was the setting. The whole Enterprise setting couldn't have happened, and some people wish it hadn't, but I say fie on you. We have an awful lot of timeline and corners of this universe to explore. Get out of here. I don't want to be rebooted to death of the same 2 basic formats. Thank you. That was the power of Vulcans. Now, Strange New Worlds, back to today, I've noticed, I don't know, you probably have too. Maybe this has been your reaction. For all the love shown, unprecedented, I will say, it was kind of a low bar, but the unprecedented affection for Strange New Worlds among the live action shows, especially. Point being that people had problems or even just disappointments with Picard. They had problems with Discovery. Despite all the folks that loved it, it was not a unanimous, near unanimous reaction to Discovery. Got better as time went on, tried to illuminate the arc of Discovery here. Picard melted down the world. Internet just boiled over when Picard was announced, right? On that Vegas stage back in 2017, was it? And then some of the promise of Picard didn't quite fulfill as big a path, as big a swath of fandom until 3rd season, maybe. Strange New Worlds is the one that broke the mold for out of the box, oh my godness. And we remember that. This is just a couple years ago. This is just a year ago. And yes, there were moment-to-moment moments where people were a little nervous about threading the needle there on canon. People were happier, especially even just the bridge redo from what you saw in Discovery, and madly trying to justify that. But as a whole, Strange New got all this love. Now, after a year of waiting, I'm seeing all kinds of cracks in that wall o' love. Part of it, I think, had to be with Picard Season 3, seemingly, although I keep reading folks who had problems with Picard Season 3. They were angry about it being such a nostalgia fest, and we've talked about that here too. Clearly, Picard Season 3 is the season that has resonated the most with folks. And even with the flaws in the methodology, even a clunky methodology, but a brand name like the Digital Nielsen's made news for having a Star Trek in its top 10 twice. One of them during rerun season after the finale had aired for Picard Season 3. Now, we've been following the Parrot Analytics here, their numbers, which is not direct viewers. They're not trying to do that, trying to measure it by internet popularity, which to me skews it already to folks who aren't watching or using the internet. But having said that, that's kind of apparent and true there too. Is this reaction this season to Strange New Worlds with one show out of the gate? I realize, and I'm always cautioning about don't judge. I'm just struck by how, and here we go. Bottom line, does it feel like the reaction to Strange New World is far more critical than it was for season 1? Is that the new has worn off? Is that the bar from Picard Season 3 is so high and fresh in memory that people are comparing the two styles? Because look, you're going back to what's amazing here is Strange New Worlds is still standalone, which is, remember our old bugaboo about serial storytelling? Well, I think Picard Season 3 maybe be the high bar for that accomplishment as well. People don't even think about Picard being serialized now. People were overjoicing when Strange New reminded the new world, anybody under 30 or 40, what standalone storytelling look like? With running arcs, but not the running arcs being the A story of each episode. They're lingering back there as the B and the C and the D. And there is still a standalone story that's unique to each episode. And that's cool. What I'm getting at here is I've seen 2 or 3 threads, again, purely out of number 1, folks who saw episode 1 and 2 at Astra per Astra, which is coming this week. Some folks who have gotten the screeners, some of the reviewers and people with privilege, and they've watched the first 5. But watching the reaction to season 1, you would think, yay, we've been waiting a whole year for this. Picard, even a lot of the folks at Picard season 3 was great, but Strange New World set my world on fire. It's my jam from last year. Can't wait. Now, I've seen people disappointed that Pike was not in season 1. Now, I did my first second opinion. If you didn't catch it, we were a little rusty getting out of the gate, but it's been up since Sunday. If you haven't, I urge you to go over and watch this second opinion since, well, the hiatus break. And I talk about some of these issues, but that's a short format. That's only 15, 20 minutes. I just wanted to get into history here. And yes, I am going to get to our topic because here's the deal. I've seen people talk about the ship. Spoilers. People talking about the fake starship that the pirates, the Broken Circle pirate group, Klingon Federation races, outcasts and outlaws have cobbled together on this border world. And why is it the same ship that's docked next to the Enterprise at Starbase 1 back on Earth? Ha! I'm just going to say we retconned this. Well, that's they've taken that number. We didn't see a ship name on either one. Why was it docked upside down? That was interesting. There is no up or down in space, only relativity. That's a thing. Why was this supposed to be Spock's first in command? He was filling in for Pike rather than all the ballyhoo around Galileo 7. That's a little more problematical. It's even a smaller mission. It was an accidental command. Do you call it a command when what you've really done is steal the ship? Does that count? No. Clearly, Spock was in command on the Great Talos 4 Pike heist in first season original series. Does that count as being in command when we're nudging things all over the place here. First season, you had the Gorn situation. We massaged that. Gorn captains are really old compared to all the new hatchlings. And they're a lot slower than all those hatchlings. That's a survival tactic. And you are just spastic and fast motioned like that as a survival tactic. And it's a survival tactic to go find and kill anything you can and lay eggs. By the time you get to the Gorn captain's age, we saw in Arena, you can be slow moving, and you have to be. A society couldn't be technological and expand and grow and be stable if all you saw if that was the life cycle we saw at adult stage last season. Now, we're going to be getting more Gorn background, apparently. Apparently with Cestus 3 right there on a map in Gorn territory. I don't know why it's confusing 7 years later. We'll see. No, the thing I started to see most off this year, the criticism was about Spock. And about Spock, even though we threaded the needle last year, I was happy. I made it work with what we know from Amok Time, what we know from season 1, what we know about Chapel's return, her unrequited love, which has gone from being a thing in the 60s to looking icky in the 90s and the odds. And now just people going, whoa, wait a minute. We love Jess Bush, but now how does that reconcile? Okay, can still do that a little bit. What people I saw objecting to this week is Spock just getting more and more intimate and chatty with his love life, with his biology, as big an issue as it was in Amok Time. Now, what I'm saying here is, and Spock being emotional, Spock crying, Spock tearing up. Now, famously, we had Shouty Spock in the Cage, 1964's Cage. We even had, yes, one of your Earth emotions, big smiley chest Spock, even at the beginning of Where No Man. And occasionally getting really angry still in the second pilot. Occasionally having lines like, the alternate Kirk, the other Kirk imposter, had some interesting tendencies, wouldn't you say, Yeoman? kind of creepy Spock even. 3 and 4 episodes into the original series run. Point being here is the same thing we said about Spock, thing I said about Spock first season of Strange New is what I'm saying now. Just because it's been a few years, we're still seeing a Spock, again, not settled, a Spock. In the old days, they would talk about trying to juggle his two halves. Well, he's trying to juggle the two halves of living in two different societies, cultures, sets of expectations. But I've seen a lot of fans really upset that he is this emo. And I would just say that that didn't have to end with what happened 5 years earlier, 6 years earlier with what we saw in the cage and even flash back to. Even what we saw in the short treks with number 1, Una counseling Spock on his first day on the ship, right? That was even meant to address some of what happened to Shouty Spock, what happened to Smiley Spock from Talos 4. It's not an overnight deal, folks. My bottom line here is it's not an overnight deal. It's not an overnight process. We still see Spock being emotional as he steals Pike in 2266. The whole lesson about the whole warning against stealing a ship, don't ever do that again, is hysterically, karmically ironic in this episode, opening Broken Circle. What I'm saying is it still feels like there's plenty enough stew. There's plenty enough flux in the Spock character to last. Good God, people. We're going to have him swing one way and go try to purge all his emotions with the Kaswan, and then, not the Kaswan, then swing back to tear up with the trauma and shock of the V'ger experience, then die, and then be brought back as basically an automaton, and gradually have his human and Vulcan sides merged finally into a stable being that gets along to the point where he's an ambassador and thumbs his nose at the Federation in late life and goes and lives among the Romulans and tries to help, and then, creates a whole new universe with his rescue mission that fails. What I'm saying here is Spock is not this static character. And he's going to do it throughout his life. And he is still, out of 200 years, he's still relatively young here. Okay, maybe not 200 years. He's still a baby here. And there's a difference, I know, between worrying about how this is threading the needle between T'Pring and Chapel and all of that. And we've talked about that before. Chapel still has her Roger Corby saga. Spock is a year away from Layla Kalomi. Yes. It was 5 years before. Okay, that's a year. If this is 2260, that's 2261. I can't wait to see it. Akiva, Henry, you better be acknowledging Layla Kalomi. Because look, gang, Spock is clearly, he's far too stable not to be able to serve most of the time. But he is still not settled in the poles of his personality. I don't mean he's bipolar or he's schizophrenic. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in his settledness, he's still experimental. V'ger is still seeking, and so is Spock. So what really struck me, though, and it really struck me the people who, want Spock and Chapel together, and they don't want to think about T'Pring out there now, much less later on, and much less what happens to Spock and Chapel, even what we see in the original series. It's never, by the time of the motion picture, clearly they've not wound up together. And if Spock is indeed the son of Sarek, who was all the intentions that Picard remembered meeting, then he's married someone else anyway. And then you're off and running with the speculation. Was that Savick decades even after Genesis? Okay, see, this is what I mean. Spock is hardly a life written in stone. As much as we think we know about him, we see him for glimpses at a time. I'm still hanging in there with this not being edgy, but just being performative. The fact that some fans are really upset by it, and here's my bottom line for today. Here's your history lesson. Hello, hold my beer, say the 70s and the 80s Spock fandom, that very same fandom that created modern Star Trek based on the popularity of Spock and the Vulcans and all of that entailed. The zine movement, the fan fiction movement, yielding into clubs, yielding into the conventions, apart from sci-fi, straight line, old school, mainline lip snob foundations. That movement by the set, when I came into fandom, it was not, there's the early days. You may think about zines as being the thing that brought back reruns and cons in the early 70s and started even in the 60s. Spockanelia, famously, we have the photo. Editor presenting it to Nimoy in costume at the Desilu lot. Yeah, it took about just a few months for fanzines to, and fanzines had been around as sci-fi APPAs for ages, but specialty in Star Trek only took off and grew. And they had been, but even by the 70s and 80s, I encountered something I did not know just coming up organically as a kid, enjoying my passions out of Star Trek, not knowing what the outside world was doing until I subscribed to Interstat and seeing what mainstream Star Trek fandom, which at the time was totally dominated, 3/4 of fandom was led by fan fiction, the fanzine editors, mostly women. This is why I always laugh at the people that think fangirls are a new, geek girls are a new thing. Arguing, and the big thing, you talk about gatekeeping, you talk about cancel culture. This faction, the vast majority of them, from what I could tell by reading their letters month after month after month for a decade, was the third season. In case you didn't know this, general readers, back when there was no bloody A, B, C, or D, the hardest core of the Star Trek fandom, Spock fandom, Vulcans, were upset at the third season because they thought, now stop me if you've heard this before, they were upset with Spock's handling and writing. They knew Dorothy Fontana had been rewritten and was gone. They knew Bob Justman. They were upset at the way Spock was so humanly intimate with the Romulan commander, and then later on, oh my God, with Droxine. Now, it should be, Droxine is actually the scene where we hear about the 7-year cycle. We knew about the cycle from Amok Time, but third season is actually where we hear the 7 years attached to it. And you can go off and debate what exactly that means, as people have done for 50 years. But led by those two tent poles, fandom, the first wave of fandom, who had been around for 10, 20, 30 years, very upset with that, to the point where people said, I don't accept the third season. Yes, this is a thing. I should have gone and gotten Interstats from those days and found the letters. I don't accept the third season. There was a chunk of fandom early on that did not. Now, we still talk about how the third season lacked in quality. Paramount had bought Desilu and was cutting budgets. Ralph Sininsky was unfairly fired because of a screw up. I mean, there were a lot of, applying the screws, and then it was thought of such a dead little show. It was dead weight. They wanted to get rid of it as soon as they could cancel it. Nobody fought for it when NBC had it on the bubble the second time. And it was almost given away to Gene for $500,000 until somebody finally looked at the books on how it was doing in syndicate. The first year or two of syndication, and it was blowing things out of the water and quadrupling local stations' ratings. And people said, maybe we shouldn't get rid of this after all. Now we'll just cook the books for 20 years and say we've never made a profit on it. But well past that point, into the 80s and 90s, there was a chunk of fandom that still would rage on and on and on about how the third season just bastardized Spock. He would never be that emo. He would never be that open with others, much less other females, much less non-Vulcan people. And I just had to laugh. I've seen people talking about this now. They're upset at the portrayals, and at least in this one episode. I thought, wow, well, everybody, all the 80s and 90s stars, of which some we've still had, they're still with us. They've been our guests on the Trek Files the last couple of years. This is nothing new. And if you're sitting there laughing at the idea of fans in the 80s and 90s, one major chunk, one driving force in fandom, if you're laughing at the superior, if you're laughing at the fact that someone is going to ignore a third of all existing Star Trek by then, okay, 2 hours here, 2 hours there, then that's the deal. Just throwing that out there, gang. Now, maybe you're not part of the crowd right now that's upset about Spock and Stranger. That's fine. That's fine. Maybe, I don't know how you're increasingly, maybe, and this is a trend we're going to see. Again, one show down, 9 more to go. 4 of them are out there in the atmosphere. One is coming in a couple of nights. If this persists, we'll see. But just so you know, when you encounter that, even if it's not your core feeling, when you encounter that out there in the fanoverse, just know they were saying the same thing in the 70s and the 80s. And if that is laughable to you, like the original series is just one big chunk of titles. It's just several lines in your Netflix queue, or in your Paramount Plus queue, or it's just boxes on the wall of your DVD collection, then go ahead and laugh. But I just wanted you to know this was very much a driving thing, and it only has taken that generation to pass by. A lot of whom, of course, were in the generation that blew up about the next generation and didn't want to accept new Star. It's Star Trek with Star Trek slapped on it. Star Trek is our Spock, and Kirk and McCoy and everybody else. That's that generation too. But I'm saying, as a fan, as a passion person, those weren't trolls. They were certainly not bots. Those were fans with feelings who cared passionately about this character, this concept, this species and culture of people who felt like it had started off awesome the way they first glimpsed it, even live on Thursday nights and Friday nights on NBC. First run viewers who felt like they had been betrayed by what they could perceive overall as a decline in quality of the show, and didn't feel beholden to do it. And even some of them, as a caveat to writing to save the show, or of course, Star Trek Lives, be part of the 10-year revival effort that finally got a movie that had an awesome Spock moment, overshadowed by all the other production problems of the first film. Again, see the 4K restoration. It's finally the movie you have not seen for 40 years. That was a rough cut you saw in 1979 and paid good money for 5 or 6 times, maybe. Just throwing that out there. But I've increasingly seen this week more critiques of this first episode, and maybe it's hyper focus on one, and by the time you get the whole season, things will even out. Maybe. But that's a thought that struck me. I've seen the trend. I saw the specifics of the trend, and it made me think of my first year in senior fandom, when I broke through and found out where all the cool kids were hanging out. And some of the cool kids were really, really fixated on this. I mean, really fixated on this. And you know what? This is why I've laughed ever since. The infamous 1986 Saturday Night Live Shatner hosted guest starring Get a Life sketch. I laughed at that all the time. I watched that. All they had in the audience were the pimple-faced teenage boys in their t-shirts. I watched that and I said, where are all the middle-aged women? That's the mainstream of fandom that I knew. But, New York kids, New York writers, that wasn't going to happen. Well, gang, that's it. I didn't know how many of you were aware of that, if that had occurred to anybody, if you were even conscious of that pushback. Again, I've seen all kinds of little canon harumps and hiccups and people, and we're already smoothing some of them down. It's fine. I've seen people say, why do they keep insisting on running up to the edge of the cliff and demanding, and doing things that make us pull back? They force us to come up with retcons to smooth some of this over. Well, some of that may be intentional. Some of it may be unintentional. But I just want to, where have you been for the last 40 years? That's been Star Trek since day one. It feels like occasionally you stick your head out. The people who didn't enjoy Star Trek 4 because it was running around on Earth instead of running around in their universe, postulating more background and universe building, world building canon for anyway. That's it, gang. What do you think? Has anything I've said struck a nerve? Has anything I've said made sense? Were you surprised? I'd love to hear from you. And if you're watching this later, once again, I'd love to hear in the comments anything that I've had to say, how it struck you, what your reaction is. And while you're pondering all that, let me just say, while I've got you here, if you are pondering a visit to the Los Angeles area, if you're coming to SoCal for Comic-Con San Diego in July, if you're headed this way for Trek Vegas in August and you want to come down to LA a bit, may I humbly suggest, may I offer a Trekland Treks. Trekland Treks are day tours that I lead. You work with me in the beginning. We pick a day. You tell me your favorite sites. I got a menu of 50 places around greater Los Angeles, all the way up from the Picard Vinery vineyards, 2.5 hours north, all the way down south a ways. Come aboard with me. We will work out 4 stops. We'll have a fast lunch. I'll pick you up at your hotel, take you back there that day. 6 hours, your own unique, customized away mission when you're here in LA. I've got dates open before Comic-Con, after, and before Trek Vegas and after. Or anytime. Doesn't have to be tied to a con. I'm just saying. Think about that, would you? It's at treklandtreks.com. If you're a Portal 47 member, you have a 15% discount, I believe, as part of the features package there too. And occasionally we run a special, so keep your eyes open for that. It's SoCal. We can go anytime. Doesn't have to be summer. So think about that, would you please? I also would be remiss now at this point if I didn't thank all of our TTL clubbers too. So yay. Thank you, Diana Hopkins, Robin Wilson, Lawrence Todd, Anne-Marie Siegel, Justin Porteous, Glinda Bruton, Chris Jiggins, Pranikasha Productions, Comedy Forecast, and Andrew Jazimski, and our TTL live wires too. Robert McLean, Byron Bailey, J.R. Poole, Hubbard Gunn Johnson, Alan Hoensi, Dave Gregory, Tobias Rex, Donya Runyon, and Casey Shafsky. Thanks so much, guys. Have you noticed we've had more guests lately? I've got some announcements coming up. We're going to have a guest who has lit the internets on fire if all goes well. So I don't want to say anything more because it's going to be a couple of weeks. But we're going to gradually have more and more guests, especially guests who don't quite fit the Trek Files and guests who don't quite fit even Portal 47. Our guest night there, which is obviously for the members only, but is always a backstage behind the scenes creative. No actors allowed. Giving these people a voice and giving fans an eyeful and an earful of their personal photos and works and memories and insights of their own work and the work of those around them over the years. For all of us backstage people that don't nearly get enough, even in this age of podcasts and expanded conventions, still so much Star Trek out there that you have no idea about. That's Portal 47. Coming up, we will have more guests here on Tuesdays Live for you. I appreciate the support here, only through my Patreon for that. So $5 or $10, very easy level, patreon.com/TreklandLive. Love for you to go over and check it out. They take it at the end of the month. It's kind of like PayPal, but not. It's built into Patreon. Please check that out. And thanks to all of our Patreoners for doing that. Meanwhile, around the interwebs, there is, of course, since it's Tuesday, also a Tuesday twofer starts with the Trek Files. And we've got the great Darren Doctorman as our guest this week. The letter that let out for bids the Enterprise D, the big one that comes apart, that undocks, the little one that was meant for faraway shots, and all the visual effects shots that Bob Justman intended to do the 60s in the 80s didn't quite work out that way. They let for bids for the startup visual effects shots and building the actual models of the Enterprise D. We've got the letter, we've got Darren's reaction, and a lot of insight about the world of visual effects in 1980 and the next generation and what it looks like today. Check us out, the Trek Files, wherever you get your fine podcasts, or roddenberry.com/podcast.roddenberry.com for all the Roddenberry podcasts. Our documents are at our Facebook page, the Trek Files, and of course, we are the only podcast with paperwork, not homework. That's all cool. Hey, we've got our TeePublic store, which has 2 sales a month. I don't always get the notice out there, but if you want some swag from any of our Trekland brands here, including the Trek Files, Cadet Alice, please check that out too. Might be a sale coming up. You never know. Watch all my channels, which are, in fact, Larry Nemecek on Twitter and Mastodon, Larry's Trekland on Facebook, Instagram, and where you are right now. Like and subscribe, and ring the bell. Don't ever get left out. And I mentioned Portal 47. Would love to have you in there with all the Portales every month. All the packages, all the features in the package. You can check that out and see yourself. I am so excited. In 10 days, going to be at SoonerCon. My schedule is up and done, and it's going to be Cadet Alice's debut at a convention. Very low key. Don't worry. We're not abusing our young talent at all. as low key as Cadet Alice, our show is, but I'm excited for that, and a trip back home too, to see family she never gets to see. So that's exciting. If you're in that, I don't know, at least 5-state area or larger, SoonerCon is growing like leaps and bounds. It's anime, it's cosplay, it's good old hardcore sci-fi, it's media trek. My good friend Kevin Dillmore, co-author with Dayton Ward on so many Star Trek novels, my old colleague I hired back on the Communicator days way back when. I'll tell you this, his first piece was an interview with Grace Lee Whitney that he was able to do at a convention in Kansas and just queried me on. And I'm like, sure. He's a guest. He's a guest this year at SoonerCon. But also Billy West, the voice of Bart Simpson, John Scalzi, who wrote Red Shirts, are all guests. So I'm urging you, if you haven't done so already, it's fairly easy. It's right on I-35 there in Norman. Come down. I mean, there's my old school SoonerCon bag back there. They're good enough to have me as a guest every year. Put me in the Oklahoma Speculative Fiction Hall of Fame last year, which is a huge honor. It's been going about 10 years. If I'm in the same club as CJ Sherry, I mean, okay, I can handle that. Anyway, if any of you can make it down, and I know some of you actually are, and we'll have a Portal 47 live dive for the members who are there, as always. Can't wait for that. I cannot wait for that. Now, here's a special announcement, though. Because of travel next week, we will skip next week for Tuesdays. I rarely do this. I usually try to do it even in a travel week, but because I've got family all the time, Janet's with me and Alice, I am not going to try to do any live streaming. I mean, unless it's at the con and we do some moments from the con. Otherwise, no produced shows. So no Trekland Tuesdays live next week. The week after that is the 4th of July. I've got plans with my Will Rogers side. So the next week after that, we're going to have a Trekland Tuesdays Wednesday edition. So July 5th will be our show after that. Then we'll be back after that, I believe. I'll be on the road, but I think I'll be good for live streaming. Tentatively, we're going to have a guest that next week, my first show back on Tuesday. We are planning to have a guest who will tickle your funny bone. And I can't wait for that, but I don't want to say any more. We're so far out. All right. That's it for today, gang. Thank you so much. Check us out on all the places. Thank you so much for your Patreon support. Thank you so much for everything else. Check out Portal 47. Think of the Trekland Treks. These are incredible days. We'll be watching Strange New Worlds this week. We'll see what they do to Spock, even as the spotlight is going to shift. Or will it totally to Una at her trial, as we all can see is coming down the line. That's not a spoiler. So what do I say? I'm going to be traveling. You're out and about. Please stay healthy. Do all the things. Stay woke. Check your sources. We're getting back into the thick of it. And just for now, especially. Trek well, everybody.